Hello everyone, I'm Sam Fry and this is a brand new episode of Technique, the podcast where we talk to artists about their use of technology. But before we start, let's hear that theme tune. Now this episode is actually presented by Richard Adams, so it would only be polite to let him introduce who he's interviewing.
I'm Richard Adams, and in this podcast I'll be discussing audio, the future of audio, the past of audio, and the present of audio, with Paul Weir, the noted computer games audio director.
Richard and Paul have known each other for a while, so this interview turned out really good. They start by talking a little bit about audio design in video games, which, as you'll hear, is a lot more than just making music. And then they go on to talk about the retail industry and where audio can make a difference. And finally, they go and turn their attention to the cultural industries, talking a little bit about theatre. So, a bit of music, and then over to Richard for his interview.
I usually describe myself as an audio director, composer, sound designer. Basically, I'll do anything that involves making sounds in any form, and if you're going to pay me, then even better. Probably more than half my work is in video games. So my two main clients at the moment, one is Hello Games, who made a game called No Man's Sky, which was released last year, but we're still developing. And I was the audio director, sound designer, did a little bit of music on that. I'm also an audio director for Microsoft's Lift studio, which is a London-based studio, which primarily does HoloLens work and new Paint 3D. So that's more of a traditional kind of audio post-production environment. Today was a good example. I was helping to engineer a voice recording session. We had about 8 actors in for a virtual reality drama, so that required kind of fairly broad range of skills to do that. But also I work a lot for a company called The Sound Agency, led by Julian Treasure, where we do commercial retail sound installations, so typically shopping centres, airports. We've just done a cruise liner, and part of the work, the section that I don't do, will be to define what their audio branding is, what their brand is in terms of sound, to look at the acoustics of the space. And then the element I get in is like the creative production side, which is creating new sound and new soundscapes to fill the space with something which hopefully on brand and is more pleasant than we have, and just creates
So let me veer off the question list straight away,
sure.
Because you've raised some really interesting things there. I was going to ask you to talk a little bit about the difference between audio and music, and I guess as we talk, that will become clear. And that is a very important distinction, because if I say you produce audio for video games, a lot of people automatically assume that means music, and it clearly doesn't to a large extent. But let's wheel back to the stuff you do with the Sound Agency. You talked there about audio branding. Can you talk a little bit more about what audio branding seems to be, and then what is involved in, the creative production that you talk about?
Sure. Well, traditional audio branding would be idents. Whenever you hear the end of a radio ad or TV ad, and that's normally what people would associate. Now, we do a bit of that, but primarily our focus is to try and get brands to think about what would personify them in terms of sound and music, primarily music, actually. So, is it a warm sound? Is it an acoustic sound? Is it electronic? Whatever. Just trying to kind of bring them down so we can actually have almost like a playlist and go, this feels suitable for where your brand is, and this isn't suitable. And that's helpful. A lot of brands haven't considered what their audio identity would be.
Well, let's list a few places that you could hear audio identity. I mean, obviously there are jingles and radio ads and so on. Where else would you hear an audio identity?
Well, we would say you ought to have an audio identity everywhere. So that, let's say you're a clothes shop. Now, a lot of clothes shops, let's say Topshop. So they've got their own in-house radio station, right? So obviously the music on their playlist is chosen because it's appropriate to their brand. Now, obviously, we wouldn't deal with those kind of people, but sometimes we do create playlists. Some places, many shops, there's no one in charge of that. So it's whatever whatever, audio streaming tracks the manager of the shop decides to play at that time. So it may have no relationship at all to what the brand represents, and maybe contrary. A really good example of that is, let's say you've got a clothes shop which caters to a slightly older market, say 30 to 40-year-olds, but they're playing like club music, really loud club music. And that's physically unpleasant. It's kind of like psychoacoustically unpleasant. And it also puts you off because you feel this is not really a place.
What do you mean psychoacoustically unpleasant?
So what I mean by psychoacoustically unpleasant is that if the sound is too loud, you automatically go into this fight or flight situation. Like loud sound in a cinema is used as a dramatic device in the same way that very low frequencies are threatening because it reminds us of, say, an earthquake or something large and dangerous.
There have been experiments, as I recall, where governments have tried subsonic sound as a weapon. Is that's true, isn't it?
Subsonic, yeah. I mean,
very low sounds to unsettle.
Very low sound. Yeah. But hypersonic speakers, which is directional sound. I mean, sound is energy, so it can be used as a weapon. This hypersonics originated, I think, during the Second World War, where they tried using loud sound, basically, literally as a weapon, with a slight bug in the system in that it affected the people using the weapon as much as people trying to attack.
Well, they were probably closer to it.
Yes, so it wasn't ideal. But it's now used widely on things like cruise liners. It was a few years ago now where there was a cruise liner that was attacked by Somalian pirates, and they were fought off by using a hypersonic speaker, which is a directional sound.
So hang on, directional sound, that means sound you can do like a spotlight, very focused beam of sound.
Yeah, so it's all heavily patented. So, like, hypersonic is a brand name. So there are equivalents now, but you can't call them hypersonic. But it is exactly that. It basically modulates sound to much higher frequency. So the higher frequency it is, the more directional it is, the less broad it is. And then it demodulates it, converts back to audible frequencies when it hits a surface. So it's not very good for like high quality reproduction. Like, it's not very good for music. It's not bad for speech. So we've used a hypersonic speaker sometimes in a bank when maybe you want to make announcements in a very specific space, but you don't want everyone to hear it because it's irritating. Or maybe you've got a little installation. I think we once did like a tree. So you got little bird song and things like that, just to make space.
You could point the announcement in the bank at the person, and only the person standing there can hear it.
Yeah, pretty well. There's going
to be some leakage, I guess.
Yeah. So they have many uses in industrial spaces for things like museums use them as well. So they're a really useful device to use. I don't know how we got into hypersonics.
Well, it's just really interesting. But, I mean, go further and talk a little bit about, I know you've done a lot of work at airports and in supermarkets about getting people to buy more with targeted sound. And I don't mean physically targeted sound, but sound that is targeted to users in particular areas of spaces to get them to engage more or relax or whatever.
Yeah, that's the bottom line is, one half of it is making sound that's suitable for the space. So if you've got a large space, you don't want sounds that are very fast or percussive because of the reverb in the space. It just becomes a mess. But the bottom line is we are trying to make people feel happier, and often that's through making them feel more relaxed, calming them down. So a lot of it does tend to be quite kind of ambient and gentle. And in the bad old days, like in the 70s, there was the incorrect assumption that if you played fast music, particularly in restaurants, that, and this was the original music idea, that people would eat quickly, and therefore you get higher throughput, and therefore you make more money. But it's the exact opposite is true, where if you play slower music and you slow people down, yes, your throughput reduces, but because people are enjoying the experience more, they'll buy more high-value items like
they'll
desserts.
buy more wine or desserts or whatever.
And they'll come back because it was a pleasant experience. So we simply work on the basis, and we have some research I can talk about, but work on the basis that if you're more calm, like an airport's a really good example. Horrible environment, very stressful, and yet you've got a lot of time to waste. So if we can make you feel a bit more calmer, a bit happier to stick around a particular area, then you're going to do that. And all the metrics point to that quite clearly. The longer you stay in an area, then the more likely you are going to buy things.
Well, you get bored and go to the shop.
Yeah.
I feel, or you start to wander around and relax and just take things in and gradually pick things off the shelf, I guess.
Yeah, and we have, I'm looking it up now, I mean, we did some very, very early research, which was not, this is not scientific at all, but I think the first one we did almost 10 years ago was with Glasgow Airport. And they told us how much on an average month the shops would make as a whole.
Yeah.
And I think I'm correct in saying they just had commercial music playing at that point. Then we got in and we played our music for one day on, then no music for one day off. And we did that for 2 months. So we could alternate through all the days. So it wasn't that we cherry picking certain days. And overall, this is why take this with a pinch of salt. But overall, the retail increased by 10% with the ambient music. Now we have done more thorough research since then, and generally we see a bump between 2 and 3%. So it's still
really worthwhile though. Over a period of time, that's a big amount of money.
Yeah, for what is actually a tiny investment.
Yeah,
and even if you don't see a bump. So some of the research we've done has been just on how people's impressions and how positive they feel towards the experience. So even if you don't get a bump in retail, every time we've done some research, it's always pointed that people are happier, people are more satisfied, people prefer sound that is more suitable for the space, even if they're not aware of it. And that's kind of the important part to that.
So have you ever worked on a piece where it has been deliberately a conscious creative decision to make people almost unaware of it?
Well, that's pretty much everything we do. We try not to be obtuse.
No, but they've been unobtrusive, and but you can still hear the tunes tinkling away. Whereas, I just wondered if you managed to sort of get that sweet spot where the customer almost doesn't know the music is there.
Yeah, well, we do try to mix it at a level where it's just sitting above the background noise, which also it depends on the environment. Sometimes we are literally just providing a background soundscape, and sometimes we're masking. So we're trying to obscure unpleasant background sounds, which we can't control. So we have done a few office spaces. So there we might be a bit louder than we'd normally be, but that is as a masked background sound and mask maybe a conversation that people are having a little distance away. And that is much harder to get right. It's really quite tricky that. We have played, our system at the moment is non-interactive, but we do have automated volume control. And we do obviously mix in the space with people around because you absolutely have to do that. And we do also playlist. So the soundscape we choose may be different at different parts of the day depending on occupancy. Okay.
Wheel back a little bit. One of the things you mentioned, an almost throwaway comment, was that, a lot of this sound tends to be quite sort of ambient and sort of, I think you said tinkly, but maybe you didn't.
You said.
I probably putting words in your mouth there. But think a little bit sort of more artistically about the aesthetics of what you produce and that sound. Does it lean towards the sort of Brian Eno ambient end in general?
Yeah, we definitely sit on most of our work. Sits on kind of the Eno side, and it's a fine line. Like we absolutely don't want to sound like a spa. Like we don't want to be new age. We really don't. But quite often we sound on a very specific space. For example, it's very common to do like the children's area, and it might be a play area, it might be a children's shop area, it might be whatever. It's that park shop, and then it'd be more obvious. It might be more playful sound. So it might be much more about creating a specific kind of atmosphere. One we did a few years ago was for Harrods, where we sound designed the children's department, which is made up of multiple rooms. And so every space was sounded different. So I had like a space area, and that was a combination of background sounds and like individual events. We had like a forest space where we had fairies who would speak to you, like little plant pots on the floor. So we had so literally like a background wash, and then spot effects, which were very noticeable and part of the experience. So it does entirely depend on the space. And, that's the service we offer, which is something completely custom to the environment.
So I know one other thing you've worked on quite a lot over the years, and another friend of mine has been working on things like similarly in film over the years, but this is something called generative sound. Mm-hmm. And I know, we're living in now an algorithm culture, so, the word algorithm is thrown around and this, that, and the other, but we both know that generative algorithmic sound has been around for a couple of decades at least. In a usable form. But could you talk a little bit about what generative sound is and the sorts of things you've been doing with it? Because I think generative sound is really interesting, as to me it has key features, and you can tell me I'm wrong in this, but in that it is literally never ending if you don't stop it. It is non-repeating, and it is generated from a rules engine, as I understand it.
Yes, so I'm not particularly purist on how to define generative sound, but essentially, as you say, it's a rule-based method of creating sound design, music. Really, doesn't matter, it can apply to everything. So essentially, you've got a randomized system with a bit of control logic to define what plays, when, how often. But because of that, you don't get into a situation of an obvious loop point. So it's a continual change. Part of the difficulty in that is, whilst it does always change, actually making it sound like it really is changing is a different kind of challenge. It's more of a creative challenge. But pretty well all the soundscapes we implement on the retail side are generative. So it has our own custom system, which we call the amplifier, which is some code we've written, and it sits on a Linux rack. That's also networked, so that we can remotely change the soundscapes and apply new ones. But I also do that work quite often in games, like No Man's Sky. Pretty well the music is run through its own music system that we built, and that is fully interactive. So it will
that got quite a lot of coverage in the press, didn't it? With the band, There was a band associated with it.
So about 65 Days of Static wrote most of the music to that. So and they collaborated very much on working with our generative system. But it was an obvious game to do it, because the game itself is a kind of space exploration adventure game. It's procedurally driven, which is a hell, we can get into that as well, as opposed to generative created. But basically it's mathematically created, the universe is mathematically created. So it is literally it's not infinite, but it's very extensive. And obviously, we couldn't write music to fill that, so we took this approach of creating a rule-based system for music, and then also making it react to how you played the game. So depending on where you're walking, how you've been doing, what you were facing, perhaps, what activity you've been up to in the recent past. So this all feeds into our system and it adapts to music. Never creates anything new. So that's.
Well, hang on. How did you get a live band to feed into that? Well, can you tell us first of all? I've got to ask. Yeah, or is it paid?
Yeah. Well, no, not at all. I mean, 65 as a band are very technical. Our approach with them was because of the founder of Hello Games is a fan of their music. And from the start, we were kind of very clear we didn't want to affect their creative process. Like, we just said to them, make an album as you would any other time, and we will use that album for the game. But once you've done that, we will then rip it all apart and create new music specifically for our music system. And actually worked very well. So we ended up with the album tracks, which we use in various forms in the game. But rather than just kind of deconstructing them, because we knew we were going to have this generative process, so all along they were keeping the bits and keeping all the scraps at the side and keeping all their sessions in a form where we could go back in. And so rather than just saying, here's the drum loop we used on track on the album, it's like, okay, we can open all that up. Let's create more drum tracks of the same type and more bass riffs. So we just really created this kind of whole plethora of material, which sounds like the album, is not quite the same as the album. And then kind of shoved that into the game. Massive advantage is we now have complete control over the mix of music, over what music does. And then to add more music is really super simple. We just create new soundscapes, and the game automatically picks it up and applies the same rules. So it actually worked out rather well for us. I think
you got a hell of a lot of coverage, and I'm not sure, but I may be wrong on this, but I thought you'd at least been nominated for awards for it.
No, we never get them.
No, criminal. Get rid of the awards.
No, that's it.
A hell of a lot of press coverage, though, and in particular I saw a few interviews with you, and the band were promoting it, and it did sound quite different when you actually were in there.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to avoid, having a soundtrack that becomes irritating, basically annoying over time. It's the same problem as retail soundscapes.
Well, for me, that felt like one of the first highly visible attempts to move live, real music, if you like, into a fully, like you say, procedural system where, taking it away from, it still has the humanity at the heart of it because humans created it and it's inspired by people. But then the computer is taking it and applying the algorithms and doing other things to that. So it feels like a joint venture in a sense. Yeah. We're the inspiration, and then the sort of remixing is being done dynamically.
I think that's a very good way of describing it. That I'm very much into humans creating the art. There's a whole
it's like an augmented reality, actually, isn't it? Yeah,
I mean, you can go algorithmic, absolutely, and people do. They've created very impressive results. That's just not, where I'm coming from.
No.
And also I tend to feel, and you can disagree with me, but I tend to feel like the closer you get to, if you like, believable algorithmic music, the more restrictive the system becomes. So you can create a jazz piece that could convince you it's been created by humans, but that's all that system does, right? So you're now locked into that, and you now have to write a whole new set of algorithms to do something different. Whereas, for me, that's overcomplicating it. Right? Humans can write good music. Right? Why are we not letting them do that?
Well, I think the same as I'm from a visual arts, computer arts background, and I often see a lot of digital art, if you like, that's out there that are things like data visualizations, and they're rather beautiful.
Yes.
But for me, they lack humanity because they're actually just pretty.
Yes, I think.
Do you understand what I mean? That there seems to be no humanity in it. It's just moving lights.
So it's like what got me into composing two things: Penguin Catholic Orchestra and Shostakovich. So if we go to Penguin Catholic Orchestra, only because what I love about their music, they've just released a new album in their new iteration. But anyway, what I love about their music is it's like late 70s and 80s, was that in their recordings, they're noisy. Like, and their strings slightly out of tune. And you get a real sense of people coming together to create some interesting, quirky, fun music. But it's very, very humane. It's like, it's so unpolished in a delightful way. And, by allowing for mistakes and embracing mistakes and noise and all the things that gives texture, that's what gives it its life, and its artistry. And again, as you said, there's some beautiful, procedural art, which is incredibly impressive. And you can accept it in its own form. There's interesting No Man's Sky, what I would say about that game is, I think we're one of the first games to really try and get that balance between human creation and computer generation.
As I say, I think it's augmented reality, actually, but it's never talked about like that. AR tends to be restricted to things that are visual, which is where I want to sort of lead next, funnily enough. But, because I know, and I'd like to carry on this conversation, because I know you've worked with VR. Certainly when we first met, you were doing some very early VR audio sound with students. But now, obviously, you're getting your hands on AR with things like HoloLens, and you're now creating audio, and you're audio directing literal visual augmented reality experiences. The No Man's Sky thing for me is an augmented reality piece of music, but this is the whole thing, the sound and the vision. And can you talk a little bit about that and an approach to that?
Yeah, not much.
Even if you can't talk about specific projects. Just in general.
Yeah, I mean, the HoloLens side, actually, the kind of work I do is pretty traditional. I can't talk specifics, but it is actually pretty traditional sound design using traditional tools. So very much kind of supplementing things like user interfaces and those kind of elements.
So rather sounds or beats and things like that, yeah.
So, but it's useful, even more useful in a situation where you don't have a controller. So yes, you've got gestures, but you need to give feedback on the gestures. So it's really valuable for that. I think the virtual reality, whether it's going to stick around or not, the kind of work we've been doing in virtual reality drama, I think it raises some interesting questions, and audio is super important in that kind of space because it really sells the idea. And when we're still not at a point where we can create believable humans without video, but having at least a believable voice, having actors performing, even if what we see is not authentic, really sells the idea.
So you're giving people enough cues to sort of recognise it as something human. Yeah. Which is the age-old thing of making, radio plays sound a particular way. I know one of the criticisms I've heard of radio drama, for instance, is it's often slightly overplayed. Yeah. And it took me a while to realise that actually that's because it doesn't work if it's underplayed like a film. Because you haven't got the vision to go with it, so you need cues.
You've got no gestures in radio drama. So, because we've worked together with a guy called Dirt Mags, who's a well-known radio producer, kind of involved in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and things like that. And his style is kind of slightly to bridge the two a little bit, that he's very physical in the studio. So rather than just standing people at the mic, we'll move a lot. We'll often play back like sound effects live in the studio. Just get a real sense of presence and depth, and often block it out maybe you would with a piece of theatre. So there's definitely a halfway house that actually is very effective. But you're right. And video games have this kind of weird hybrid in that actually they're often performed as radio dramas. But that doesn't always work because you have got the visuals. And so sometimes quite often, it seems over-exaggerated. And yet it's hard to get that balance right.
Oh, it's really hard. I mean, what are your favourite sort of games that you've worked on? What do you think's worked best? I remember you worked on Thief, for instance, some years ago. That was, you had to use the audio to navigate the game successfully.
Well, Thief I resigned from. That's an example. Well, we enter Although when I was involved, actually, yeah, we spent a lot of time casting and doing some really kind of, I thought, interesting performance work.
What do you think? Move away from Thief then a little bit. What do you think of the problems with video game audio that you hear, without mentioning specific other games, because we're not in a slanging match?
No. Actually, I think in the past 5 years, the quality is just tremendous. I mean, it's rare to get a poor sounding game now. I mean, really super. I think, if you were to address an issue, it would be it's quite traditional. That you would think it would be a bit more experimental, and certainly the titles, Inside, a fairly recent game, which has really phenomenal sound design. But you think it'd be technically a little bit more adventurous, and sometimes it is, if given the environment. But it's difficult because creating new audio technology is, an absolute minefield. It's expensive, time-consuming. You no guarantee it's going to work. And if making a game costing a lot of money, that's a big risk. But
I suppose the biggest risk is finding the right audio and music people.
But yeah, finding the right audio director.
I mean, talk a little bit about that, actually, because obviously a lot of people who read the Create Hub site and listen to this podcast are in smaller creative agencies. And I know audio is often viewed as a luxury with that, but there are occasions, obviously, where they're going to do audio, because most of our listeners, most of our readers are digital in some way. I mean, what are the things you would look for in hiring an audio or music person?
Well, it obviously depends on the field, but there's 2 or 3 elements that are like the basics. One is obviously depth of knowledge, and experience is important, but actually not. I wouldn't say it's the number one. It's kind of enthusiasm is super important, willingness to learn, capability, and experience. You can introduce someone to experience; they will gain that, and a sense of vision as well. I think it's interesting, and I might be completely wrong in this, but it feels to me that there's actually not that many experienced audio directors, certainly in this country, knocking around. It's just to have gone through it for 20 years, and be comfortable still being a sound designer, creating content, but also willing to kind of take the overview. I mean, definitely there are people around, without doubt, but there's not loads.
I mean, you think it's, in a way, a small enough industry that you still have to be the craftsman and producer?
Well, no. Well, people tend to, once you don't spend that time, like anything, you tend to kind of levitate towards the management side. So you tend to be an audio manager, so just managing the teams, and rather than having hands-on creative input. And that's quite hard to maintain. It's one of the things I've always been adamant that, I could earn more money running big teams. I don't want to do that. I want to keep making stuff. And I guess my strength, if I'm able to say that, is, I'm not a programmer, and although I get accused of being a programmer by other programmers, but I do have a good technical knowledge, so I enjoy and often will create new technology for projects I work on, and seem to have a good relationship with programmers because I think I'm good at defining what problems are and what potential solutions are without creating some crazy thing that no one's ever going to do. And audio can be really rewarding for a programmer because it's the kind of thing where actually a few small steps can make a big difference. And a lot of game programmers, you kind of graft away for a long time before you see the rewards of what you do. That's slightly off a beaten track.
Okay, so round up. Let's spend a few minutes thinking about the future. We're moving into an era of algorithms, computation, augmented reality, VR, whatever. All the technologies that everybody sees in the magazines, etc. Where do you think audio and digital music, I suppose, is going in the short term and medium term? I mean, it's pointless trying to forecast long term. But, there are some trends coming out, I think. And what sorts of things do you think we'll be hearing?
Well, I guess to be a bit self-serving, I think we're going to see more of this kind of retail soundscape side though, and certainly more companies doing it now than were a few years ago. I think we're much more...
Is that part of the... Sorry to interrupt, but is that part of the... Do you think that's tied up into the whole economic cycle that's going off of high streets closing, smaller shops closing, and bigger out-of-town experiences being built?
I don't know. I think when budgets are pushed, this is the area that is seen as luxury. The music gets pushed out. However, you have the advantage that when you convince one of the kind of the big owners, because there's not that many owners of things like shopping centres, then they will obviously kind of start to roll out to their other places, and particularly on new builds. So the plus side is obviously the more we do it and more other people do it, the more it's seen as something that you have to do because your competitors have done it, and it's cheap to do compared to anything else. And I think people are also more aware that it gives them, although the margins may be small, it still gives them a narrow uptick, and obviously anything counts. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. They've not lost anything.
What about within the arts? So, for instance, I worked for the last 2 years at the Royal Shakespeare Company, and one of the things the RSC did recently was work with Intel to produce some quite stunning theatre visuals using, effectively augmented reality and so on. What do you think of live spaces like that? Because I know you've written theatre music and sort of operettas and things like this. Where do you think, in more traditional settings like theatre, audio could go?
Well, I haven't done theatre for a long time, but I think what you're seeing is a lot more crossing over technologies. And theatre, like to a certain extent, also film. It sounds wrong to say this, but in some ways slow to adopt to new technology because it changes work practices. And like in film, theatre, work practice, they have works really effectively. So adopting new things sometimes is difficult. But I think, and partly from video games, you're seeing more of a blurring of line of the kind of technologies. For example, there's a lot of discussion about procedural audio, which is modelling, well, it's no great definition, but I would say it's modelling sound based on algorithms. So it's completely computer generated with a high level of interactivity. So it's deeply embedded into the game or into the theatre space or whatever it is. So really using modelled sound. A lot of discussion, not that many people doing it, but that's certainly an area that seems to be growing a lot. And it's not new, we started doing this 15 years ago. But now obviously because of computational power, and because it's iterative, some people start doing it, others do it more. But we're definitely seeing more of that. That's a whole separate topic. It's quite a deep one to get into.
Indeed it is. But do you think the future is one of more sound, but more psychologically targeted sound?
Yeah, I think a lot of psychoacoustics as a field is still relatively new. And sometimes it's just the simple stuff like a lot of what we do has wind, water, or birds in it, right? Because it works, right? For various reasons why innately they are very calming for us.
Well, innately we haven't evolved in the last 3,000 years, particularly.
Some people less than others, but yeah.
So what would have worked for people 5,000 years ago would work now, I'm guessing. So, natural sounds would have an appeal for us.
But also, I think, it's outside this topic, but the way that we respond to sound, like we respond to sound faster than we do the sight. And obviously we're hearing all the time, and we're hearing from all around us. So there's a lot of ways in which obviously sound is constantly changing how we feel, and sound is constantly manipulating people in terms of feeling certain things in different ways that we do visually. And I think obviously that's been used in film for decades, but bringing that over into the real world is becoming increasingly common. And yes, it's manipulative in the same way that any other marketing technique is manipulative. But I think we're definitely seeing more of that area.
So it's interesting, isn't it? It's extending the concept of a soundtrack to your life, which is what people are doing when they are walking around listening to playlists.
Yes.
They are creating an audio experience into which they can retreat. But we are actually saying, well, once you take the headset out and you're in the real world, you're going to get another one that is created by us. Yeah.
I don't agree with everything that Ian's ever said, but
No.
There's a quote he has in a book 15 years ago where it says something like, like a child says to its parent, oh, do you mean in your day you always used to listen to the same thing? And we've seen over the past decade this kind of granularization of music. The album is not an album anymore, and the next step to that is the playlist is the album, and the computer generated playlist is the album. And so what we're doing in terms of a modular, granular, generative soundtrack that sits in the real world, where one stage would be quite esoteric, now is a completely acceptable thing to do.
So that was Richard Adams speaking to Paul Weir. You can find out more about Paul Weir online. He does have a website. It's earcomaudio.com, where you can find out a bit more about his work. Or otherwise, you can follow him on Twitter at earcom. That's EARCOM. This was the second in what we're hoping is going to be roughly a monthly show of Technique. So stay tuned for another episode coming next month. Plus, we're hoping by next month we should be able to give a bit of an announcement about some future events. You might remember that last year we ran an event at Google Campus London where we had 4 artists talking about their use of technology, and we're trying to work on something coming up soon. So hopefully there'll be news by this time next month, so stay tuned for that. And then the other way that you can keep in touch with us is to follow us on Twitter. That's at Technique UK, where we'd love to hear a little bit more about what you think about the show. If you've got any feedback, let us know. If you think there should be different types of features in here, or if you think there's someone that you want to hear from that you think would be good interviewing, then let us know and try and put us in touch with them. The last thank you is actually to the music for this show. It came courtesy of Quiet Music for Tiny Robots. A bit of a strange name, but hopefully you enjoyed the music. Otherwise, we'll look forward to speaking to you next month. So see you soon. Next time on Technique.
It allows for people with dementia to have the opportunity to be able to enjoy these visuals and somehow be stimulated by them in some way.
I interview Sonia Lee on the topic of dementia.